Next stop, Forgotten. The driver's voice, muffled and crackling over the speaker, yanked me violently from the abyss of sleep and into the harsh light of reality. I groaned and rubbed my eyes, feeling even more drained than I had when I boarded the bus hours ago. Next stop, Forgotten. Okay, what the fuck? This guy wasn't making any sense. Had I missed my stop? That wouldn't be good. Next stop, Forgotten. I reached into my overstuffed backpack and pulled out a crumpled map, on which I'd marked my journey west. The night before, I had left my home in Saskatoon, desperate to get away. Like most 16-year-olds, I hated my life. My family was dysfunctional, with a stepfather who treated me like a burden, a mother who just stood by and let it happen, and a bratty half-brother who could do no wrong in the eyes of my parents. At school, I was either ignored or bullied, because apparently, being more into books than fashion magazines was on par with being a leper. My job as a grocery store cashier was lousy. I had to deal with rude customers and my asshole boss, and got paid shit. I had decided to get away from it all. Now, as the bus rumbled along a dusty road, flanked on either side by wheat fields, I studied the map. Since I had no idea where I was, it wasn't much help. I decided I would just get off at the next stop and figure things out from there. Speaking of the next stop. Next stop, Forgotten. What did the driver mean? Had he forgotten the town's name? Or was it actually called Forgotten? I looked around, hoping one of my fellow passengers might be able to shed some light on the situation. None of them seemed very promising. There was a shriveled-looking old lady in a purple and yellow floral print dress, knitting a red scarf, a young man with long black hair and red-rimmed eyes, who appeared stoned out of his mind, a girl around my age, asleep and snoring loudly. That left the driver. I stood and walked down the aisle, holding onto seats and poles for balance. The driver, a tired-looking, droopy-faced guy with a thatch of wiry gray hair, stared straight out the dusty windshield. "Shouldn't you be sitting?" he muttered. "Sir, what do you mean by next stop, Forgotten?" "The next stop is a town called Forgotten. Not that anybody ever gets off there. Or gets on. I'm getting off there." He glanced sideways at me, eyebrows raised, and snorted. "Crazy teenagers," he muttered. My temper flared. "Excuse me? Look, I don't appreciate your... Sit down or I'll make you walk the rest of the way." I stomped back to my seat. What an asshole. Now I really wanted to get off this bus. To pass the time, I thought about my family back home. Surely they had noticed my absence by now. They would probably call the police, to maintain the illusion that they were caring parents, but secretly, they would be rejoicing. And relieved that it was me who had vanished, and not my brother Will. Screw them. Finally, the bus chugged to a stop, groaning like an old man. My fellow passengers didn't move. They seemed completely oblivious to what was going on around them. Hadn't the bus been packed when I first boarded? How long had I been asleep? It was clearly daytime, but I didn't have a watch, so I couldn't be sure. The driver just grunted at me as I walked by him. I stepped out into the blinding white sunshine, my backpack heavy on my shoulders. The bus rumbled away, leaving a cloud of exhaust in its wake, and I was alone. The bus stop was nothing more than a splintery wooden bench. Beyond it lay the town, if you could call it a town. Forgotten consisted of a lonely stretch of road, with buildings and houses scattered haphazardly on both sides. Nothing matched, it was just a mindless jumble. There were no cars in sight, or people. "Fuck," I muttered, tending a hand over my eyes. "Is this a ghost town? Maybe I should have stayed on the bus." My instincts told me to stay put, but my feet were stubborn, and began to move. I started up the empty road, eyeing the storefronts and houses. They were all in pitiful shape, sagging porches, boarded-up windows, peeling paint, overgrown lawns. The road was full of holes. In one yard sat a rusty Volkswagen Beetle, its original color indistinguishable beneath the layers of wear. I kept walking, too curious to turn back. Consulting the map again, I noted that Forgotten wasn't on it. This sad little place clearly lived up to its name. So far, the silence had been broken only by my footsteps and the sound of my own breathing. So, when I heard someone moving behind me, following me even though their footfalls were soft, it sounded louder than an atomic bomb going off. I froze. My blood roared in my ears, and even as chills shuddered through my body, sweat began to trickle down my neck. No, I thought. No. No. This can't be happening. This was a horror movie scenario, and I didn't want to be that stupid girl who gets herself killed by making all the wrong choices. However, I didn't know if I should look back or keep walking. It seemed both might get me killed. "Hey!" The voice made me jump several feet into the air and stumble back. I landed flat on my ass, my hands scraping painfully along the road as they braced my fall. A girl stood over me. Pale, skinny, S-length hair the color of corn silk. Light blue eyes bulging against the concave of her cheekbones. She wore a yellow t-shirt and faded blue overalls. Grungy white tennis adorned her feet. "You don't belong here," she said. It wasn't an accusation or reprimand, simply a statement. Yeah, I figured that out pretty quickly. I examined my hands, which were raw and bleeding. "Who are you, Clara?" she said. "I'm Holly. I didn't think anyone lived here." "Not many," she said. "Just a few stragglers. I take it you're just passing through?" "Yes." Clara walked over, took my arm, and pulled me to my feet. "Where are you headed?" "British Columbia," I told her. "I want to see the mountains. And the forests." Clara blinked her gigantic eyes at me. "Mountains." She spoke the word as if it didn't quite fit her mouth. "Come with me," she said. "We need to clean up your hands." She turned, wordlessly, and headed in the direction of a ramshackle house. With no other choice, I followed her. The house might have been pretty at one point, but now it was just a dump, with the porch rotting away and the picket fence leaning to one side, like crooked teeth. The roof looked like it was caving in, and the front lawn. It was a freaking jungle. How could anyone live there? Clara opened the door, the rusty hinges squealing like a pig being slaughtered. Dust billowed out, making me cough. I entered the foyer, which was dark, dank, and smelled of neglect. "Come on," Clara said. She spoke so quietly, as if she didn't want to be heard. I wondered if she was alone in this house, but decided not to ask her. Yet. She took me into the bathroom, which had black mold growing in the tub and deep cracks in the tiled walls. A steady drip 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 of some murky greenish liquid fell from the rusty tap, landing in the chipped porcelain sink. Mercifully, the toilet seat was down, but the smell was enough to make me gag. I sat down on the toilet, watching Clara rifle through the medicine cabinet. She took out a roll of gauze and a tube of antiseptic cream, then muttered "I'll be back" and left me alone. This was too weird. I began to wonder if this was all a dream, if I was still on the bus, putting more and more miles between myself and home. Now I was stuck in this lonely town. And although I knew I could stand up and walk out any time, I wasn't ready to leave. Clara returned with a bucket of water, which looked clean enough. I soaked my hands, then let Clara disinfect and bandage them. "There," she said, offering a tired smile. "Now you just have to let them heal." "Thank you." I smiled back at her. Despite not knowing her at all, I felt a kind of rapport with Clara. She had gone out of her way to help me, a total stranger, when she had no obligation to do so. She hadn't judged or asked questions, just took my hand. That was more than I could say for anyone I knew back in Saskatoon. "I guess I better get going," I said. "Do you know when the next bus is coming?" "Once a day," Clara told me. "You can't go back out there. It isn't safe." "What are you talking about?" "Let's hope you never find out," she muttered. As we exited the bathroom, a thin, reedy voice floated down the hall. "Clara? Is that you?" An older woman sat in a wheelchair, her face half hidden beneath a heavy curtain of graying brown bangs. Like Clara, she was skinny as a plucked chicken, dressed in a shapeless dress that accentuated her bony frame. Her eyes were clouded with cataracts. She was blind. "Yes, Aunt Wendy. It's me. We have a visitor." The woman Wendy rolled towards us, the wheels of her chair creaking. I stepped forward, extending my hand. Hi? I'm Holly." She took my hand, staring up at me with sightless eyes. "It's nice to meet you. But you shouldn't be here." "I know." "She can't leave yet," said Clara. "Not until the bus comes back." "No. She can't," Wendy agreed. "Tell me, Holly, what brought you here?" "I was on the bus," I told her. "Missed my stop, so I got off here." "I see. You should have just kept going." "I know," I admitted. "Aunt Wendy, I'm going to show Holly to her room," said Clara. She led me upstairs, to a dusty room, empty save for a narrow cot. The ratty white sheets smelled mildewy, and I had no intention of sleeping in them. The window, of course, was boarded over, but thin fingers of sunlight had squeezed through the gaps. I thought of the town outside, so empty, and unexplained tears sprang to my eyes. I turned around, wanting to thank Clara for everything. But she had disappeared. So I sat down on the bed and waited. What the fuck am I doing here? That question played on an endless loop in my head, even as the sun went down and shadows crept in, encompassing Forgotten in their darkness. Once again, I was awoken by a voice. A female voice, soft but frantic. "Holly?" I cracked one eye open, my head still fuzzy with the dream I'd been having. Something about my parents burning everything I'd left behind in a raging bonfire. I found Claire leaning over me, shaking me awake. "What is it?" I mumbled. "You have to stay awake, Holly. You can't let your guard down." "Huh?" I sat up, rubbing my eyes. I could hear noise from outside. It sounded like chanting, deep voices speaking a language completely unrecognizable to me. "What is that?" I demanded, but Clara just shook her head. She was trembling, her eyes filled with tears. From somewhere down the hall, a woman sobbed. "Wendy." "Clara," I began, but she put a finger to her lips. The chanting was growing louder. And closer. "Now you know why you can't leave tonight," she whispered. "They will get you." "I don't understand." "We have to wait, Holly." Clara's eyes gleamed with tears as she spoke. My eyes drifted upwards, to the boards nailed across the window. For the first time, I noticed a small hole, where a knot had fallen out. "Holly, no." Clara hissed. At first, I saw nothing. Just an endless mass of black, stretching on forever. "Holly, stop. You don't want to see this." The blackness before me suddenly lifted, like a curtain being pulled back. And finally, I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of humanoid shadows, marching down the road. Featureless, save for crimson eyes that glowed like lanterns. The bizarre chanting poured from unseen mouths, filling the cool night air and rising up and up into the cloudy sky above. They were following a leader, a tall shadow, nearly 7 feet, with long, gangly limbs, carrying something over its shoulder. An emaciated woman in a white nightdress. As I watched, my hand pressed to my mouth, the shadows abruptly stopped. Their leader dropped the woman, and she flopped like a rag doll onto the dirty road. The impact jarred her awake, and she began to scream. "No. Oh, sweet Jesus, no. Please. Don't do this." "Another sacrifice. They make one once a year," Clara murmured from behind me. "Soon, there will be no one left in Forgotten." I wanted desperately to look away. The poor woman's terrible screams tore at my ears, and as the shadows closed in on her, the terrified wails turned to heaving sobs. Clara yanked me back, and we huddled together on the bed, listening to the poor woman die. Whatever the shadows were doing to her, it sounded like she was being tortured, in the most agonizing ways imaginable. Like being dunked in boiling water. Or having her skull slowly crushed in a vice. Or being skinned alive while someone poured lemon juice into the open wounds. By the time the horrible sounds finally ceased, my face was wet with tears. "It's over," Clara muttered. "Let's go check on Wendy." My new friend held my bandaged hand as we walked down the hall and entered Wendy's room. She lay on her back, staring up at the ceiling. Her body shook, and tears leaked down her face, flooding the lines in her skin. She was mumbling what sounded like a prayer. The chanting had started up again, but now it was distant, slowly fading away. Despite the boarded-up windows, I felt the shadows could see us, their red eyes burning into our flesh. "They're gone," Clara whispered, more to herself than me. "But they'll be back." I looked over at Wendy, who appeared to have slipped back into sleep. "Jesus," I muttered. "No." Clara shook her head, smiling sadly. "He can't save this town. Nobody can." Too numb to feel afraid anymore, I walked past her and returned to my own room, peering through the peephole once more. The shadows were gone. All that remained of the woman were a few scraps of white fabric and a pool of blood, glinting in the moonlight. The last thing I saw as I passed out were Clara's blue eyes, practically glowing in the dark. "Next stop, Saskatoon." The driver's voice, muffled and crackling over the speaker, yanked me violently from the abyss of sleep and into the harsh light of reality. I opened my eyes. I was back on the bus. The lady in the floral print dress was still knitting. The stoned guy still sat there, staring at nothing. The teenage girl was still fast asleep, still snoring. My backpack lay at my feet, the rolled-up map sticking out. Next stop, Saskatoon. I was heading home. Thank God. But how had I gotten here? Clara. Wendy. The town of Forgotten. Had it all been a dream? Next stop, Saskatoon. I smiled to myself. Soon, I would be home. Soon, everything would be back to normal. I'd be back with my dysfunctional little family, back at a school that didn't accept me. But it would be familiar. Safe. Just a dream, I thought, smiling to myself. Just a crazy dream. Then I looked down. And I gasped. My hands were wrapped in gauze, spotted here and there with dried, maroon blood. I had fallen and scraped them, I now remembered. Clara had patched me up. Holy shit. Had it been real? Is something the matter, dear? Asked the old woman. I'm okay, I lied, shoving my hands inside my pockets to hide them. Are you sure? Yes. Hey. Have you ever heard of a town called Forgotten? I have indeed. It's been abandoned for decades now, although I'm not sure why. Then she lowered her voice and added, it was rumored to be cursed. Something about shadows wandering the streets at night. And making human sacrifices. Sounds ridiculous, right? Yes. I felt the healing wounds on my hands open up again, felt fresh blood seep into the bandages. It does. Next stop, Saskatoon. I leaned back in my seat, my head resting against the dusty window. The bus rolled along, putting more and more miles between me and Forgotten. Leaving the nightmare behind. Leaving Clara and Wendy behind. And as the bus wheezed to a stop, I made a promise to myself. I won't ever forget.